We're going to finish our next section here on the era of Reconstruction. Remember, Zoom meeting Thursday morning, 10 o'clock, and test Friday. And I should be getting your tests graded this week and starting to get your papers in as well, including some of the original papers you did as extra credit. The papers you're doing now is not extra credit, the one on your favorite Civil War commanders or leaders. All right, where we stopped on our last part of this section was we were talking about March of 1867, Congress passing the first Reconstruction Act that required Southern states to write new constitutions, required them to ratify the 14th Amendment, and allow African Americans to vote. Okay, so starting on this section, we are talking about Andrew Johnson. He is impeached. And Republicans and President Johnson had been at odds for several years over Reconstruction, among other things. They had a bitter feud, bad blood between them, and to be honest, the Republicans wanted him out of office. And an election was coming up in 1868. In February of 1868, the House of Representatives voted to impeach Johnson. And impeach just simply means to bring formal charges of wrongdoing against an elected official. Terms in there that you'll need to know. The Senate tries the case, and the president can only be removed from office if 2/3 of the senators found him guilty. Okay. In this case, the Senate turned out to be one vote short of conviction, and Johnson served out the remaining term of his presidency. One short. There was a lot of, once again, bad blood there. Politics is always an ugly business anyway, even in the best of times. But Johnson just misses being convicted. But even one of his leading opponents did make a comment back then. He felt like these charges were really more political than anything else. 1868, a new president is elected into office. Ulysses S. Grant. It should be a name familiar from our final chapter, or the prior chapter rather. He is elected president in 1868, running as a Republican, and he winds up taking over, of course, building off of his, momentum and popularity from his victories as a general in the Civil War. All right, some of the other amendments that popped up at this time you'll need to know. The 15th Amendment forbade any state to deny African Americans the right to vote because of their race. All right, you'll need to know that. The 15th Amendment was proposed by Republicans in 1869 and ratified in 1870. Now, all African American men over the age of 21 had the right to vote. Now, we're talking about having the right to vote, and if you'll notice in there something we'll mention later on in our other chapters, it was all African American men had the right to vote. And of course, the battle over women having the right to vote, really by 1870 is already underway, or has been underway. But we'll talk about that as we get to those chapters. Changes in the South were coming. There was still bad blood and resistance to change in the South. Southerners who supported Republicans were considered traitors. And were called scalawags is one of the terms they use, a word used for small scruffy horses, but it was not a very, it wasn't a term of endearment, I guess is a better way of saying it. So if you were a Southerner and your neighbors knew you were a Republican, they probably viewed you like I said, the term they used, scalawag, they didn't view you very well, and viewed you as a traitor to your state, to the South. Northerners who came south after the war were not very well received either. Some with good cause, but others not so much. And carpetbaggers, a term you'll need to know. These were fortune hunters hoping to profit from the South's misery. At the time, they were not obviously viewed very fondly either. Those are all terms that you'll need to know. And those are terms maybe you've heard before. Maybe you weren't sure exactly what that meant. All right. All right, the other thing that was a big change is freedmen started getting elected to office, and only in South Carolina did African American women win a majority in one house of the state government, but no state at the time elected a black governor. So you got to remember the population in some of these southern states. If all free black men could vote, they're over the age of 21. The population in some of these states. That gave them political power in numbers, and of course that was something that some did not want at all. So with this going on, this led to the section is the spreading of terror, and of course the most famous, or I guess I should say infamous, of these secret societies that were formed was the Ku Klux Klan. It was formed to keep blacks out of office, as well as white Republicans. Not just blacks, but white Republicans. But they certainly didn't want African Americans getting political power. The Klan, most of y'all are familiar with their antics and their look. They dressed in the white robes to hide their identity. Rode at night, terrorizing African Americans and their white allies. Just taunting, maybe terrorizing, threatening, and then of course doing even worse. There was also voting restrictions that southern states started, trying to find new ways to restrict blacks from basically exercising their rights. Poll taxes were implemented, and this required voters to pay a fee each time they voted. The reason behind this would be, this keeps a lot of your blacks coming out of the Civil War. They were not in a position to start paying poll taxes, in terms of their income. They also knocked out maybe a lot of poor whites. They instituted literacy tests, required voters to read and explain a section of the Constitution. These were things that, they couldn't. They knew a lot of these people who were just freed from slavery couldn't read or write. So these were things that they figured out ways to do to essentially disenfranchise them. Now for the poorer whites, they wound up actually finding a way around it, as long as they knew they were going to vote the right way. They figured out ways to allow them to vote if they couldn't pay the poll tax or read or write. Segregation. It is a term meaning separating people of different races in public places. And after 1877, segregation became the law basically of the South. Jim Crow laws is a term there in your notes. Laws that separated blacks and whites in schools, hospitals, restaurants, theaters, trains, streetcars, playgrounds, cemeteries. So these were, when you hear, and other places too, but this is what we have listed in your book shows, and also what I put in your notes. You will need to know what the Jim Crow laws were. Of course, segregation in the South, lasted well into the 20th century. I don't tell as many stories as I do when we're standing in class, but I can remember as a small child, this would have been mid to late 70s, going to my doctor's office. And although the doctor's office at that time was no longer segregated, it hadn't been that very long since it was. And I can remember when you walked in the door, you could either go left to the waiting room or right to the waiting room. And the whites back in segregation went to the left side, and the blacks went to the right side. And when I came along, then once again, there was no segregation, but people still followed that same pattern. They were still following the same pattern, almost by habit, I guess, because it hadn't been too many years since segregation had been ended. But you'll need to know the Jim Crow laws. Plessy versus Ferguson. This is a Supreme Court case, very famous. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation was legal so long as the facilities for blacks and whites were equal. As you hear the term separate but equal, but that was ruled in 1896. The results of Reconstruction you'll need to know. Some of the things that did come out of it: the South gained a public education system. They expanded its rail lines. All African Americans became citizens despite continuing to face discrimination. So these are a couple things that did come from it. There was some good things that came out of it, although it was not a smooth transition, and there was certainly a lot of troubles that came out of it. But that's where we're going to stop today. Once again, anything you don't understand through the notes, don't get, have a question about, make a note, and I'll see you Thursday at 10 o'clock for your Zoom meeting. Thanks. See you then.